Well, everyone, it's almost that time again. After a brief respite at Grandpa's house, another presidential election is just around the corner, which means once again we all have to perform the ritual of pretending this New York billionaire and establishment figure of American celebrity culture is either a super normal man of the people or a shocking invasion and grotesque corruption of American values. During our last go-around, I made a video called Donald Trump is Not a Fascist, which to this day is probably my least understood video. I don't think my argument could be much clearer, to be quite honest, but I thought it might be useful to respond to some of the criticisms it's gotten so we can more usefully think about what's actually at stake in this election. Some are more fair than others in that they at least invite some degree of thought and conversation instead of just aping the latest Twitter dunk and acting like they came up with it themselves. I can already tell this aged like milk. This aged like milk. This aged poorly. This video aged like milk. This aged like fucking milk in the sun. This aged poorly. This video sure aged like milk. This aged like milk. This aged like milk. You know when a 5-year-old expects the adults in every room to think a bit they've lifted from Paw Patrol is as cute the 200th time as it is the first? But if we add some sort of adult vocabulary to this comment, the substance of it goes something like this. 4 years ago, when you made this video, I can understand why you would have had this opinion, but now Trump's fascism is so obvious as to render this position hopelessly dated. I don't even know where to start with this. We are talking about the same guy, right? Donald John Trump, 45th president of the United States. The same guy who said immigrants are criminals and rapists and installed a Muslim travel ban and both sides did a white supremacist demonstration that killed someone and downplayed COVID to make himself look better and canceled a diplomatic trip to Denmark because they rejected the suggestion of him buying Greenland and used the National Guard to disperse protesters so he could do a photo op holding a Bible like a kid who got socks for Christmas and incited a riot that he did nothing about for hours even after people were injured and killed and tried to get his vice president to illegally reinstate him as president. That Donald Trump, right? I cannot figure out where this is coming from, this suggestion that there's ever been a time we can point to in Donald Trump's political life where he was somehow like more tolerable compared to now. Donald Trump has sustained every bit of his racism, sexism, and regard for ostensive American laws and values for the past 4 years. 8 years, honestly. 10 years. As long as he's been in his political life. Nothing at all has changed about how Trump speaks or appears to think about any issue, except that he's just gotten more incoherent because he's a gross old fuck who doesn't take care of himself either physically or mentally. If he is fascist today, then he was fascist 4 years ago also. When people say this is an argument that aged poorly, what they seem to be pointing toward, if I can interpret this in a way that makes sense, is the amount of circumstantial support Trump has gained in the past few years, right? The fact that people like Stephen Miller apparently just feel a lot more comfortable being totally evil on camera than they used to. And that's the point of calling people fascist, right? It's an attempt to startle people into recognizing that someone is an evil authoritarian. Trump is an evil authoritarian, so what's the problem? How does it make anything different? If Trump's administration and his supporter base is fascist, then that makes him fascist by extension, regardless of what he personally believes. Trump not being fascist doesn't make the situation any better. This really seems like a semantic argument. God, this comment drives me insane. It makes me want to walk into the sea. When I go to hell, Satan himself is going to wake me up every single morning by saying, that seems like mostly a semantic argument. I don't believe in semantic arguments. Or pedantic arguments, if you like, because that's really what's meant by this. Either the meaning of words and why we use them matters, or it doesn't. I will never be compelled by the suggestion that we just shouldn't think about the words we use or why we use them. The problem is that I don't think we are interrogating why the word fascist carries such emotional emphasis to begin with. I will tell you why it holds such emphasis now. Fascist, in its current use, is a word that was very much defined during the post-war era, first and foremost, in derogatory opposition to the emerging free market democracy ideal to which every other country should aspire, or whatever. So the word isn't describing any kind of actual codified political ideology unless you are referring specifically to Mussolini's version. Even the Nazis didn't claim the term fascist. That's not an excuse for the Nazis. It's an interrogation of this weird thing we've decided to call fascism, whose definition appears to just magically shift its borders to incorporate whatever we decide we don't want to be known for in the moment. The word fascist is implicitly always positioned as oppositional to American values and behavior. And because of that, all sorts of shitty American customs, the entire culture we've built over the past 100 years that produced Donald Trump, basically gets a complete pass. That's my problem with the word fascist. To be a fascist, colloquially, is to be whatever American identity isn't. The social function the word fascist exists to serve is to label somebody as not like us. It's the word that takes you as far as you can get with political analysis without resorting to insult, even though an insult is functionally what it is. It's almost exactly the same function the word communist had during the Cold War. And we can see this real time in how Trump has been described as a fascist by Kamala Harris or John Kelly and Mark Milley, government officials whose opinion about this carries a lot of weight, despite the fact that if we're thinking about how to define fascism, I literally cannot think of a less reliable source than officials of the US government. Why? Because the US government has an extremely good incentive to define fascism as fundamentally oppositional to American business as usual, even when that definition describes American policy. So, let's take General Kelly's definition.
It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultranationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy.
I'm sorry, is the United States not militaristic? Has the United States never been ultranationalist? Has the leadership of the United States never believed in a natural hierarchy, forcibly suppressed opposition, or established dictatorial leaders and centralized autocracies across the world, even as we've declared ourselves the global model of democracy? John Kelly's description of fascism is almost to the letter exactly how the United States has conducted itself as a global presence for nearly 100 years. Okay? Our standard of behavior abroad since World War II has been to systematically overthrow democratically elected leaders of countries that might pose an ideological threat to American capitalist interests, install right-wing dictators, and then say we're making the world safe for democracy. Over the past century, the United States has murdered millions of people doing this. So, I just think that at a certain point we have to acknowledge that fascism as a concept is so broad that the lines we use to denote it take their shape based on whatever the political establishment needs it to be. Honestly, as far as I can tell, fascist is basically a word that was built to provide plausible deniability to post-war imperialism. The word fascist is like a fetish we use to curse people with ostracization when they get a little too mask off. The modern American standard of behavior is basically that as long as somebody important isn't calling you fascist, then you can have a little bit of murder and authoritarianism as a treat. It's interesting that this annoys me so much. I think it's because people on the left and the center, everybody who's center and left of, are supposed to be the educated ones, right? People on that side of the political spectrum are such snobs about their measured and reasonable assessments of society. We're supposed to be like the forward-thinking ones, right? Like the ones who make an effort to be skeptical and informed. But like this fascism thing, as it relates to Trump, couldn't be more thoughtless or reactionary. It couldn't be less critical. And I think this is pretty well reflected in this actual scholarly opinion, which is usually actually a lot more ambivalent than the journalistic headlines about this issue would lead you to believe. It's so typical. Somebody will ask a professor whether vaccines work, and the professor will say something like, well, it's not a magic bullet. It's not a 100% type thing, but it's good that we have vaccines and they provide a lot of value. We'd be a lot worse off without them, and they'll definitely be better in the future. And every headline will be like, science confirms vaccines are trash. But I'm increasingly kind of annoyed at how scholars are also sort of appropriating this journalistic trend. So here's UNC Chapel Hill professor Christopher Browning writing about a new kind of fascism. I've resisted using the word until now, but something menacing and novel is taking shape with the possibility of a second Trump term. So this looks like a pretty straightforward assessment of Trump being fascist, but what he actually says is not exactly what the headline implies. For me, what Trump is offering for his second presidency will meet the threshold, and the label I'd choose to describe it would be isolationist fascism. Until now, such a concept would have been an oxymoron, phenomenon, a historical phenomenon without precedent. Trump continues to break every mold. And that's the end of the article. It's this failure to actually think farther than this that annoys me. The reason Trump continues to break every mold is not because he's some magical supernatural force that just instantly undoes rules as soon as they're established. Trump is not a mastermind. He's a fundamentally stupid person who relies on the gravitational pull of bribery and celebrity to keep things running smoothly for him and him alone. And even if he were a mastermind, it would still be the case that if you set a categorical standard and the thing you're studying continues to break that standard, then it's not the thing you're studying that's the problem, it is your model. We should not just throw up our hands and act like the thing we're studying is some magical, unnameable impossibility just because it doesn't behave in whatever way we wish it would so we can sustain the structural integrity of our categories. So what's the point of having this conversation? How does saying Trump isn't fascist change anything about what we should do? I think this is a fair question. Okay, as much as this annoys me, I think this is a totally fair question to ask. I used a taxonomy analogy last time, so let's use another one. This is an eastern brown snake. This is a king brown snake. Both of these snakes are native to Australia and look basically identical, but if you get bitten by an eastern brown snake and get king brown snake anti-venom, you're gonna die. And if that happens, you probably won't be comforted on your deathbed by your doctor telling you, well, at least we can congratulate ourselves for recognizing that both these snakes are brown. I do think it's worth pursuing a definition of fascism if we can get away from fascism basically being code for anything America isn't willing to admit they do. To the extent that our current definition is workable at all, I will tell you that the main difference I see between Donald Trump and the behavior we keep calling fascist is Trump's complete lack of any collectivist principle. If there's any consistency to fascism as a thought structure, it is certainly a sort of sincere collectivist glory tied to an imagined idealized past, right? And that's just not what I see in Trump. He is very open about how little he cares about any kind of moral standard, good or bad, that doesn't benefit him personally. And that's not to say that this collectivist attitude isn't present in certain sectors of MAGA as a movement. It's the case for a lot of the people Trump surrounds himself with. Many, if not most of whom I would say, gun to my head, absolutely qualify as fascist specifically because of this imagined past they're trying to materialize from scratch, right? But Trump himself? No. Absolutely not. Trump is not trying to regain a glorious past. He's trying to sustain whatever glorious present it is that has allowed him to lie and cheat and steal his way into power, fame, and wealth. He does not want to be a leader. He wants to appoint himself child king, which is honestly just a small-scale version of the position the United States has had globally for the better part of the last century. For Donald Trump and most of his followers, the freedom offered by America as a social project is specifically freedom from responsibility. They think freedom means the ability to act like a complete shithead anytime, anywhere, and avoid the consequences. He has no principles, collective or otherwise. He is a liar and a cheater, and that's quite literally the reason people like him. The reason he's a populist icon is because he's been living in elite society for the past 60 years and is admitting that the lack of any kind of moral or ethical standard that drives the seats of social and economic power in this country is the real American way. The American way is to put up a principled front and then lie and steal and cheat behind closed doors. Trump followers think that him admitting that is what makes him honest. They think he's saying freedom means we should all be able to lie and cheat and steal, that every human interaction is a zero-sum game, and the greatness of America is that we got the drop on everyone when we were pretending to be friendly emissaries of democracy. If you confront a Trump supporter with January 6th these days and ask what they have to say about Trump refusing to peacefully leave office, 10 times out of 10, that supporter will say that Trump did peacefully leave office. And their evidence is that, well, Biden is president right now, not Trump.
And I understand he denied the last election results, but he also left the White House the day he was supposed to leave the White House.
Is this stupid? Yeah, it's stupid. They've just decided it doesn't matter as long as they get their way, because that's the model of behavior Trump represents. That specifically, that freedom from responsibility, is a moral badness that simply isn't described by fascism. I have to date encountered no definition of fascism that frames it as an ideology that promotes disengagement from the community. Quite the fucking opposite. Fascism is pathologically engaged with the community. The entire practical function of fascism as we know it right now is to micromanage how people live, make them responsible for upholding a strict set of social laws until every individual is a perfect copy of the national ideal. And that's not what Trump is trying to do. Trump is not thinking about that. He doesn't care, because he doesn't care about anything. If we abandon the term fascism to describe the danger that Trump represents, as I believe we should, then I think the term that should replace it has so far best been described in Professor of Philosophy Aaron James' book, Assholes, A Theory. An asshole, according to James, is a person who systematically allows himself to enjoy special advantages in interpersonal relations out of an entrenched sense of entitlement that immunizes him against the complaints of other people. Basically, an asshole is someone who completely acknowledges that a functional society requires people to follow a certain set of rules, but believes that he should only have to follow those rules when he feels like it. This is basically the structure of the American economy, culture, and government. We're all subject to certain rules, but only losers and idiots take that seriously. The real winners of society are the ones who take what they want and challenge you to tell them no. Trumpism is philosophical assholery transformed into a public virtue. It is not restore the glory of the Volk, it's fuck you got mine.
What we have is not a democratic system, it's a system of legalized bribery. In most countries, if you give politicians money to influence their vote, that's called bribery. It's corruption. It's illegal. We've managed to eliminate the corruption problem largely by legalizing it.
If you watched the first video and concluded that what I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't worry about Trump because he's not a fascist, then you either, I'm sorry, have piss poor media literacy skills, or you didn't watch the video. The result is the same. I agree. Trump not being fascist doesn't make things better, it makes things worse. It's evidence that there are forms of authoritarianism that exist outside our primitive understanding of a flat spectrum between different kinds of 20th century collectivisms. If we refuse to acknowledge that freedom from responsibility is what Trumpism represents, then we're disregarding the rot in our culture that allows American standards of behavior to dovetail so easily into the violent authoritarianism we keep calling fascism. The fact is that if you construct a country based on the idea that power is achieved through bullying, bribery, cultural attention, gross displays of wealth, and constantly and very publicly redefining moral standards based on what benefits you personally, the natural result is Donald Trump. Trumpism is not foreign to American values. It is the logical endpoint of American values. When Donald Trump is dead and gone, his ghost will still haunt everything we do. It'll be in the way we extract and coerce and manipulate, both at home and abroad, and in the way we arrive in places, again, both domestic and abroad, with big promises about greatness and utopian prosperity, and then only leave once we've ruined them. This is the thing we need to address if we want to avoid another Trump in the future, that I don't think is served by calling him fascist. What we need is not rejection, but acceptance of the fact that Trump is something we actively created as a country. The United States and the people at the top of its hierarchy has maintained its power specifically by deploying accusations like fascism, by pointing at everything and everybody except at itself. That's basically the entire Trump playbook. Deflect, attack, never allow yourself to be subject to something as pedestrian as accountability, because that's for losers.
Attack, attack, attack. If somebody comes after you with a knife, you shoot him back with a bazooka, okay? Rule 2, what is truth, Tony? What is truth? What is the truth in life? Deny everything, admit nothing. You know what's true? What I say is true. And third of all, and most important, no matter how fucked you are, you never, ever, ever admit defeat. You always claim victory. Always.
You know, that sounds like the U.S. foreign policy for the past quarter century.
Being an asshole. Being a person devoid of honor or integrity, whose only true, heartfelt belief is that honor and integrity are for the weak and stupid, must be enough of a reason to not elect somebody president. And if it's not, If we have to resort to pretending American culture and Donald Trump don't obviously share a genealogy in order to get rid of him, then this country is way more cooked than we're willing to admit. So yeah, vote against Donald Trump. Absolutely, please do. Oh my God. But don't vote against Donald Trump because he's a fascist, because I don't know what that word means, and I'm honestly not convinced anybody else does either. Vote against him because he sucks. Vote against him because he's weird and gross and thoughtless and narcissistic and criminally careless and cruel. Vote against him because he has no policy to speak of. Vote against him because after 10 years of political engagement and supposed business acumen, he still doesn't even know how a tariff works, even though tariffs are his only economic position. Vote against him because he's a vacant shell of a person who tells everybody around him whatever they want to hear so he can feel a shred of the love he was denied as a child. And then, when you voted against Donald Trump, don't congratulate yourself for voting against a fascist, because if you don't think the American federal government is itself dyed-in-the-wool fascist, and I certainly wouldn't expect Kamala Harris or John Kelly to make that argument, then Trump isn't either. He is something different. He's an asshole. And regardless of what happens in this election, the next thing we all need to do is address the fact that America is not a nation full of fascists, it's a nation full of assholes. I know, it's disappointing that this isn't Inglourious Bastards and we are not Aldo Rain. This is a fact that allows for a lot less glory and opportunity for heroism than I think we'd prefer. Certainly less than I'd prefer. But I truly believe in my heart of hearts that if we wish to conclusively get rid of Trump and any future incarnation of Trump, the first thing we need to do is own him. Like a mental illness. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. This election is a matter of having one Trump now or having a Trump every few generations forever and ever. If Kamala Harris wins, as I hope she does, the culture that created Trump will still exist, both in her administration and in the society we all live in, and it'll be our responsibility as citizens to stop being such mafia wives about it. So that's what I have to say about that. Hopefully this is the last time I ever have to talk about it. Have a good election.